Well, welcome everybody to our mini MACNA panel discussion for 2021. We've got an awesome selection of panelists here with us, and today we're going to be talking about why coral and fish appear to go through trends in popularity and what mechanisms and different actors kind of drive those price fluctuations. So this is a really relevant topic to hobbyists who may not understand why they go into a local fish store and see a torch priced at $49.99 one day, and then the very next day it's at $300. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists here. We've got Dr. Kevin Erickson, the president of MACNA. We have Alan Lukin, who is the brand manager at Seagrass Inc. We have Hunter Hammond, who is the 2017 previous MACNA speaker and fairy wrasse extraordinaire. And then over at the Biota Group, we've got Jake Phillips, who is the general manager. And finally, we have Joanne Vega, who is the president of the Spokane Reef Society. So welcome, everybody. Really happy to have you here. And thanks for taking the time to talk this out with me for the next 45 minutes or so. So I wanted to jump right in and just kind of set the theme for us. Why do coral and fish appear to go through trends in popularity? Why is this a thing that we see? It's embedded in the collector world, it's embedded in the wholesale market, it's embedded in the retail market, and finally, it's embedded in what we see on forums and in blogs and stuff like that throughout the trade.
Tim, I have this idea that it's kind of a chicken and egg scenario, as a discovery is made, whether it's in a new collection area or someone with a decent camera and a filter and maybe some scuba diving equipment can go and take a photo of something new, and then that item is then sought out by hobbyists, so then collectors go and find it, and it kind of builds, and someone writes an article on it, and it builds and builds and builds. And then from there, then we branch off on color morphs and everything else.
Yeah, I think to add to that, a lot of what we see in trends and how what you're kind of speaking to, where there's pictures taken or there's social media or what have you, where it becomes really popular, then there's the conversion of getting that information to suppliers or communicating how these animals are brought into the country where they'll ultimately be sold. So there's a good starting point there, but then ultimately you've got a very complex supply chain with multiple facets that really help push these trends all the way to the end consumer, to the hobbyist.
I think it really kind of sparks once that kind of name gets onto it, because once it has a catchy name on it, then someone's like, I want that coral with that name, not like I want this kind of green and blue looking mushroom. And once it has a name and a lineage and kind of that ID behind it, then everyone's looking for it and trying to get it out and trying to get frags of it.
Just to bring up that point about the name game, I mean, that topic could be an entire panel discussion on its own. A lot of hobbyists love it and buy into it. Other people absolutely detest it. But I personally think the name game really does set up kind of this collector atmosphere where people get into a specific type of coral and then they just need to expand their collection. They need every new morph that comes in.
As you say, at the hobbyist level, it seems we see a lot of, I think back to my OG days when I first started, right? And when corals had names, that meant it was survivable and it was something that is easily traded and kept in captivity. Like I am, gosh, being from the Northwest, I'm like the Idaho grape monopora, that's something that we would always keep, and it's a name coral. It's just a monopora cap, right? We all know, but because it has a name, we always knew that this is a captive bred coral. It's highly survivable, and this is something that as a hobbyist that you can add to your collection, and it's reliable.
Yeah, and I think to touch on that, if you're going into like forums and you see someone else has this coral in their tank at these parameters, this par level, it kind of makes the difficulty of getting that coral or having it actually survive and propagate in your tank that much easier.
The name game doesn't always stick, though. I mean, it takes the right hype at the right time. I mean, we've seen it before too, where something will get pushed on a blog and it just doesn't catch. Some of it too is it's got to be the magic formula where there's got to be a steady supply, but it's also an intentionally trickle supply too. That doesn't do any good if something gets hyped and then it's not really available for the next 6 months. And on the name game, I think that's changed over time too. I mean, what you just described a moment ago, Joanne, about names implying lineage. I think that used to be more true than what it is. It still exists today, but it's not like it used to be 10 years ago.
Absolutely.
That name mattered a lot to people, and it did imply something. Today we could pick a coral that's the same coral, right? But it's got 4 or 5 different names that people have stuck on it over the years. So it gets a bit more complicated today for that.
Someone like an importer, would be always on the lookout for something that a collector has that's new and exciting, right? And so even if the collector isn't naming it themselves, that importer, and no matter the country, can then be naming it and kind of not revealing their source. And then another importer or wholesaler is like, wait, where is this coming from? And you can kind of tell based on the individual. And I'm starting to form an opinion now. Maybe there's also differences here between at least sessile invertebrates and invertebrates. Maybe with we don't really see a lot of named crabs species out there or anything, but maybe there's a difference here too. From Hunter's last point, I'm kind of thinking about that between the corals and the fish. But yeah, I mean, that's the whole point of the business model is, to compete with other wholesalers, you need to be always on top of the latest and greatest thing.
Yeah, and from the wholesale perspective, we spend a significant portion of time essentially on social media, going through forums, and on a larger scale, there's reports, Nielsen and APA and places like that, that do big reports on trends and everything. But when we look at things like the name game, especially with corals, I don't know any crabs that have specific names either. But with corals, suppliers very rarely, if ever, will get involved in the name game because it becomes so complicated, so convoluted, and changes relatively frequently until something is settled upon. So they won't name it because they'll do color descriptions, and then it's up to an importer or even to the point where it's to a retailer, because not all importers, not all wholesalers will go to the extent of saying this is this hobby named coral. That the name game is definitely a trend, but as far as a scale perspective, it doesn't scale up beyond kind of the hobby level and the retail level. Once you get into the wholesale and to the importer market, more often than not, you see blue acropora, green acropora, and then they get to retail, and that's when we start divvying up names and whatnot.
Yeah, I agree. It does appear to be pretty taxonomically focused. You've got certain vendors that deal just in zoanthids and high-end zoanthid and paleothomorphs. You've got colloquially known as the stick people that are dealing with SPS and rainbow tenuis and stuff like that. But it raises a good point. Who has the most sway? Where is the area that people are really driving change?
It depends on how ultra it is, right? I mean, is it just marketing? I mean, and I think marketing has a lot to do with it. You in false scarcity, right? So if you have 10,000 gallons of grow out space, the public doesn't need to know that. You can bring in 700 heads of a torch coral and just say, I just got one in, and it's super ultra rare, and you just build this market around it, and you build the hype, and then you're going to release it in 5 weeks, and you'll have an auction. You do everything in your capacity to drive that price up and that rarity up. And then there might be a super ultra or more modifiers in front of it, right? I see Alan smiling. What do you think?
Yeah, so I agree that there's definitely some the ultra, the super ultra, that goes on, but that I think when you look at who are the biggest drivers of pricing and the craziness, a lot of what was just described is more a retail level type thing, right? So what can you do to get a hobbyist to buy this? Now, there's definitely, everything you listed, Tim, has an impact on pricing, but from an import level, from a wholesale level, the ultras, the crazy marketing, I'm in marketing, so we do marketing, but not near to the extent where it drives massive price fluctuations. We try to prove why our supply lines are the best and so on and so forth, but on a retail level, you're trying to physically get somebody to come into your store or to your online space and purchase something. So to me, when we look at it, we look to our retailers for how are you guys pricing things in the market right now? Here's what we can get it to you for. What can you get for it? Is really our theory in that.
I've got a question there for you, Alan, because I feel like maybe in the last 5-6 years, it's maybe changed a bit in the sense that it seems that some people on the collection side, on the export market, have gotten a little bit in tune to what some of the demand is too, and have started to increase what they're charging for things. So has there been a shift in that regard, that it's being back driven from the front end to the back end?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's true that from a collector standpoint, there are, especially in the coral market. The fish market, collectors definitely stay on top of trends. Everybody has social media, and it's easy to get involved in trends. But on the coral market, there's definitely collectors who are getting more in tune with what a market's in. We think so much about the United States market, but in reality, the United States is one cog in a very large machine. So what are the markets demanding? And coral collectors and folks who do mariculture in particular are really keeping tabs on that recently. And I think it started to really show. You look at the torches, and even when we get into the crazy acroporas, a lot of that is driven, the supply of it, I should say, is driven by the suppliers keeping tabs, knowing that if you have the ability to go collect 10 things and there's 20 things to collect, you collect the things that you've seen that are in demand, that you know that you can sell, and you know that are going to be valuable to the market.
So we mentioned about the hype and the marketing or anything, but we have recently seen a couple examples. For example, Indonesia not being able to export coral anymore. So Jake, can you speak to anything about how you've seen kind of the effects of Indonesia closing for wild collection and what that's done to your business and market?
Yeah, so we import corals, mariculture corals from Indonesia. So we do keep tabs on when wild things kind of shut down. You see pricing kind of fluctuate, or even if mariculture, all exports from Bali or Indonesia in general close down, then you do see that pricing kind of skyrocket. And that's a definite demand increase because now these corals are sought after. There's not many coming into the US or into anywhere really. So it's a hype driven by policy change, definitely.
Yeah, and so let's talk about that, the Indo closure real quick, and especially its relationship to the Euphilia craze, the torches and frog spawns and hammers and all that stuff. So obviously it was partially fueled by the Indo closure. Is this a clear example of how markets respond to perceived shortages in policy change? Because I mean, there are Euphilia that could come out of other areas, obviously, and Euphilia are very well established in aquaculture markets and things like that, so they're around. But is this a response to a perceived shortage, or was there actually a major shortage in these species coming into the country? Can anybody speak to how aquaculture and especially like hobbyist retail aquaculture kind of filled the gap for supply on the Euphilia in the last 18 months or so?
So for the Indo closure, it had obviously massive impacts, right? But what it didn't do was have a one-time impact and then it's done and now Indo's open, at least for now, and then it's all going to be over. These kinds of impacts change the market for extended periods. I'm not going to say forever because we don't know it. I don't have a crystal ball in front of me, but long term, and there was definitely a perceived shortage kind of early on as things started to come back, but there are long-lasting impacts with CITES and the permits and quotas that are being allocated to these suppliers to just be able to ship. They, especially from a mariculture standpoint, had supply ready to rock and roll, and then it's cut off. And when the quotas finally came back, the quotas, the numbers that they're allowed to export just from those documents are not equal to what they were prior to the closure. And that's due to a lot of things, a lot of legislation. That could be a whole separate talk for hours and hours. But they're going to have lasting impacts. And it's definitely one where you look at what policy did and how it's going to impact pricing in particular, because pricing has skyrocketed for good reason, more red tape, more paperwork, lower supply, and then obviously a demand. Everybody's talking about it, everybody wants it. So yeah, it's going to have long-lasting impacts. Policy changes absolutely drive pricing and availability within this hobby.
Yeah, and I know Tim mentioned specifically the Euphilia. I think a big reason why that driving factor for those Euphilia is because Indo has so many notable Euphilia that have been coming into the trade for years, and everyone kind of wanted a piece of that. And I know a lot of what drives the pricing and what kind of drives the demand is if you can frag and culture it. Maybe a hobbyist can sell a frag to fund something else in their tank, and it kind of turns into this business model of you kind of internally paying for your tank with through all these frags. So maybe I can get a Holy Grail in 6 months. I can trade that Holy Grail for the next new big thing. So I think it's definitely what people think they can make their money on within the industry that kind of drives that aquaculture. And if there's so much demand from it and not much coming in, that kind of drives that price increase too.
Honestly, before Indo closure, it was becoming popular, and there were high prices in those Euphilia in the hobbyist circles. I see from where I sit that there's a combination of factors, a limitation in other types of species that were available. This is a species that does grow fairly well in home tanks and in, and especially with even the lighting at the time. I mean, our lighting in our tanks has changed dramatically. So yes, hobbyists are making money off of it because that's what we do, right? We always want to offset our costs, but just the differences in collection practices over time, the fact that I am under the understanding that they don't ship well. So that is part of the reason why they've always had trouble, and that there's something that has to be traded more locally and within communities, because if I order one from a vendor in Florida tomorrow, I don't know if it's going to survive shipping because it'll get banged around the bag and going all the way to Spokane. Who knows what will happen to it.
I think it's another great example of pricing, though. Prior to the whole Indo closure and the craze there, if you go a few years further back, there were lots of torches around that people could hardly give away. Ones that were selling for hundreds later. And so some of it was timing. It's this perfect equation again, where the supply shuts down, it's ramping up in popularity, and then there's really no supply besides aquaculture, so it really drove prices. Now that Indo's open, I mean, quotas aside, I feel I've kind of been watching the market a little bit in that regard, just because I do think this whole topic is interesting. And it seems to me that some of the prices are starting to back off now. Some of the things that were really, really super crazy expensive, the Holy Grails, Dragon Souls, that sort of thing. They've stayed up, but some of the others, just like the regular, more common Indo Gold, have certainly backed off from the peak of what they were. So it's a good, timely example of how the supply certainly affects the prices that things sell for.
How do you all think that this compares to the bounce mushroom trend that we saw just a couple years prior? There was a Reef Builders article that came out, the big mother OG worldwide corals bounce mushroom on the MACNA showroom floor in 2017, I think sold for $8,000, $9,000. I mean, just astronomical prices for a single coral. So what's the deal with that one? I mean, was it a hobbyist fueled trend? And can we expect to see more of them in the future? Was the worldwide corals OG bounce just this crazy coral that looks so much different from what anybody else had ever seen that it just set its own market trend? And similarly to what Alan was talking about with the Euphilia trend and it having a lasting impact on market pricing and things of that nature, we still see the high-end mushroom market alive and well today. A lot of people thought that it would be a short-lived fad, but that doesn't appear to be the case. There's just more and more morphs that are coming out. Hobbit bounce, Frankenstein bounce, worldwide corals biohazard bounce, all of these different things that have different color morphs that kind of seem to be filling the void left behind by the worldwide corals OG bounce. Most high-end collectors probably have an OG bounce in their collection at this point if they're into mushroom corals, and I think we're just going to continue to see new morphs of crazy corallomorphs come into the trade through the wild supply chain. And just kind of continue to drive that trend forward. What do you all think about that one?
Poor mushroom corals are so underrated. I think they're one of those corals that are really coming to their light as we start really changing our color spectrums, and they look totally different under what we have today versus what we have in metal halides. I've got some mushrooms now that I've had for 15 years, and they look beautiful now. If I can only get them to bounce, I could be a millionaire.
Yeah, I think she brings up a point there too. Like if she can get them to bounce, then they instantly come up in pricing. So I think these hobbyists are really interested in something that's almost natural that we don't really see in nature, that they can kind of add to their tank and grow and flourish. And so I think it kind of is that, like, I got something that like is only found really in the aquarium industry and not found in nature that is in my tank and I can look at every single day.
This isn't a trend from the wholesale perspective that is much like the Euphilia trend. The bounce mushroom, that very much so on the hobbyist, the high-end retail side. We can't go to our suppliers and say, hey, send us 20 bounce mushrooms. They would look at us like we had 3 heads. They don't know what we're talking about. There's a couple that do now, because it's been going on for so long, but it's one that's very much so hobbyist driven. But I think Joanne made a great point, and one that is kind of the driver of a lot of trends is the technology advancements with equipment. When I started, I had mushrooms in my tank and I couldn't tell what color they were. Now we get mushrooms that all look the same until you put them under nice LEDs, and all of a sudden I've got 45 different names of mushrooms. So I think that is making a huge difference in that particular segment.
Yeah, and I think from a wholesale perspective too, a lot of times we'll be selling customers the same mushroom that we've been growing for 3-4 years, and then some client of ours is like, all right, I'll take all the ones you got of those and tell when you have more. And I'm like, all right, so there must be something to this mushroom that this guy wants in this one area. So then we kind of figure out if it has a name in his area or if he's starting naming it. And I know it's happened with a few different one of our mushrooms that like we thought were really cool looking, so we were growing them, but they turned out to be I guess amazing looking, or something that was a real kind of a fuel for a lot of the hobbyists in that area.
So you're making business decisions based on potential future trends, or you're keeping, some stock in-house so that you can grow them out, and kind of an investment.
Yeah, well, we never like to run out of anything at Biota, so we try to have mother colonies and replicates in a bunch of different tanks and trying to grow things kind of all the time. And if something does kind of take off and we have to sell out all of our babies or something, we still have replicas that we can grow that and have that investment for the future.
Well, you can offer a price, and the bigger point I think too is that you can offer a price, but someone has to pay it too, right? So at a wholesale level, there has to be room for the retailer to be able to make their adjustments for the market. And so, but you guys are dealing in more quantity at a wholesale level than the retailer is potentially. And I think at least Jake is doing some direct to hobbyist. Is that right?
Yeah, we started doing that in the beginning of the pandemic.
Okay. And now even with more shipping delays because of weather and more pandemic, and then, fewer flights, then potentially that's the best interest of the animals too, to have a smaller supply chain, one less step for that animal to travel.
Yeah, exactly. And our supply chain is already really small. We've got our breeders around the world. They come directly to our facility here in Florida, and they either go direct to store or direct to hobbyist, really.
What I really wanted to bring up was the danger factor. And I know it's a pretty controversial topic, but there is, there's a significant level of risk and kind of risk accountability that we have in the trade, especially for young collectors that are either going down on scuba or snuba or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, I think we have a good aspect on that because at Biota, we do breed some of the deep water fish. I think Blaschanthius was one of the big ones. And I just remember vividly at when we first announced them, I believe that was MACNA, New Orleans. When we unveiled the tank, people came over and they saw that captive bred Blaschanthius. And the first thing everyone touched on was the pricing is going to go down. And as much as we want to bring the pricing down, we haven't gotten to a point where we're breeding them in large commercial numbers yet. But I remember significantly a lot of people who are deeply in the industry and not hobbyists were like, thank God, like people don't have to die for this fish to get to somebody's tank now. And that's kind of like a harsh reality that a lot of us don't really understand, that like this is a dangerous fish to collect, and that's why it has that higher price point. And also with their swim bladder issues, bringing them up to depth is another issue. Their survivability, eating prepared foods and things like that. So I think a lot of people are thankful that some people do venture into the deeper water animals to be able to breed them, in hopes that someone may not have to lose their life collecting this fish in the future, or also bringing that price down in the future.
Yeah, I think danger is a good story to sell, and there's definitely an inherent risk with getting in the ocean to collect a live animal in a potentially a third world country. There's a lot that goes into that, but when you really look at collectability, so to speak, price-wise, a lot is driven by just how easy is it to get to the point where I can collect the animal, right? Obviously, depth of water is one thing, but physical geographic location of where is that animal abundant at, where can they actually legally collect that animal plays a huge role into it. Is it something they can walk off the beach, walk in the water with their nets and collect? Or is it something where they need to take a small boat 3 days to some very remote island, then walk into the beach and collect? So that plays a big chunk. Yeah, it's Borboneus anthias. There's some deep water butterflies and angels that fall into that same category that have price driven in large part by how deep and how dangerous potentially it could be. But the primary focus for a lot of pricing in that respect is based off of just getting to the animal, period.
Yeah, and then on our end, like when Brian Green and Tom collected the Abe's angels, like it's also who can actually go to those depths. Like there's only so many limited people that can go and collect a species like that, which warrants that kind of crazy price point, because when is another one of those going to get collected?
Okay, everybody. So we're about halfway through our panel discussion. We actually just got another guest panelist surprise. Matt Peterson, welcome to the fold.
Thank you for having me.
Is with Coral Magazine. He's a man that needs no introduction. He's covered just about every hobbyist trend that we've touched on tonight already, and he continues to put out really awesome material that is directly related to everything that we're talking about today. Since we're about halfway through our panel discussion, I also want to remind all of our viewers that if you have any questions for our panelists, or if you have any questions for myself, go to macna.org/questions. You can submit any questions that you have there, and we will answer them live after the panel discussion. We were just talking about collectability and how the collectability of a fish, whether it's a deep water blotched anthias or something else, affects its price tag on the retail market. And I wanted to bring up another group of fishes. Hunter, this is mostly for you because you're the wrasse man extraordinaire. We see some of these other wrasses like the pintail, the lineatus, the golden rhomboidalis, they all command really high price points. Do you have any insights on why that's the case? Is it an artifact of just a few collectors targeting them, or is it just more of a niche group of hobbyists, and so there's not a whole lot of collection efforts going on for those species?
I've always had the impression that the fish price market, if you will, is, especially with the wrasses in particular, is very much driven by the supply chains, the collection side of things. You mentioned pintails there, which is even a decent example in that about 10 years ago was the first time we had seen any before they even had an official description, and they went for several $100s, and then they just went away for several years. And when they first finally came back, when someone found them in the collection side of things, a place where they could be collected, and we saw them re-enter the market in the States, they came back at about somewhere in the $300 range. Well, from that point, fast forward to today, the popularity has only increased, the collection has ramped up even more, and the prices today can be down around $100. And that's happened just within the last 5, maybe 6 or 7 years. And there's several things to that, but it's all on the supply side. The collection has ramped up. The story I had been told was one collection outfit pretty much knew where to find them, and they had a night around the bar with some other collection houses, and people got to talking, and the secret got out. And so other collectors also knew where to find them, and just, more exporters had them available from that point forward. Other species is really driven by some things Alan touched on a little earlier. It's very much a matter of where are they found, how remote is that collection, how many people can actually collect there, the depth at which they're found. And so all these things, and again, Alan's already talked about it, but all these things really drive the price primarily. There is a bit of a supply and demand side of things, but I think that's really a secondary or even third, down the line player in the fish market.
Do you think sensitivity of some of these Cerulabra species to also drive some of it? Because I know with wrasses in particular, they can be sensitive to shipping stresses, pH issues, alkalinity issues, things like that. Do you think somewhere along the supply chain, if some are getting lost, that also may drive some of the increased price?
It certainly does, but it's on the supply again, right? If they have problem shipping them, it's only going to drive the price up. And we definitely see that with some. I don't even think so much on the Cerulabras, a bit, but the one that really comes to mind is the Chodai, the Chote's leopard. That's one that's super touchy, and I think the supply isn't half bad, but it's a matter of getting ones alive to sell in the States is not a great percentage. And so that species in particular, the price gets driven by losses for sure.
Yeah, that's a good example of one that when the phrase "it's driven by losses" is said, it's not so much that tons of them are being shipped and they all come in and they come in poor quality. It's not so much that, so much as for these shippers, when they delve into these species that aren't already popular, they do it in small amounts. They make sure they can do it right first. So some of these species, like the chotes is a great example. Could they be collected more? Probably, but we haven't figured out that magic sauce to get them consistent quality, throughout the supply chain. So it's not that, to paint the picture, it's not the morbid picture of we keep sending them over and over again. It's more, until we can figure out exactly how to get one here alive every single time perfectly, we won't delve into larger quantities and allow the market to kind of settle off.
Then Alan or Jake, is there then, a demand or some sort of request from industry then to ask researchers in our space to try to close the life cycle of those, that family potentially, or that genus of animals, so that we don't have to be shipping these animals halfway around the world?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest one is our mandarins. I mean, the reason why our mandarins are so successful is because they eat pellet and frozen food. When you get a wild caught one, they have such a specialized diet in the wild, they're most likely going to starve in your tank unless you're pouring pods in every single day. But the biggest requests we get from hobbyists every single day are cleaner wrasse, and we're working on them. But everyone always wants, and now that Hawaii is closed, everyone always wants a Hawaiian cleaner wrasse that actually survives in their tank, because it's a really cool fish and it has that symbiotic relationship with the other fish in the tank. And it's just a super high in demand fish that no one's really been able to keep over and over again.
And there's sort of like a symbiotic relationship with aquaculture and what you guys are doing and sustainable collection, in the sense that aquaculture advances technology and husbandry skills so much, just inherently, right? And the learnings that we can gain from that actually will benefit for those who still want to choose, sustainably collected species from the wild. So that the strides you guys make in aquaculture specifically have impacts beyond just aquaculture and the supply chain. They have impacts on every source, in that respect.
So I want to shift gears just a little bit here. We've now heard Jake talk about Hawaii. We've heard Hunter talk about Hawaii with the flame wrasses, and Jake talk about Hawaii with the cleaner wrasses and the demand for those as an aquacultured species. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the increases in yellow tang prices recently as a result, or partially as a result, of the Hawaiian fishery closure. Just wanted to use this one as a last case example for fish in particular. To the panelists, considering this is a fairly widespread species, it's got a more broad distribution outside of Hawaii. It's assessed from a conservation perspective as least concern, will we see prices in yellow tang start to stabilize as they become available from fisheries outside of Hawaii? And second question to our aquaculture people especially, will aquaculture rise to meet the market demand of that fish? We're seeing price points of $450, $500 when just a couple months ago you could pick up a yellow tang for $50 or so. What is the price going to look like on that in the near and maybe 2-year out future?
So for your first half of your question, and then I know Jake will be able to speak to the aquaculture much better. As far as, with the closure of Hawaii, obviously prices of existing that were able to be shipped or that were in transit or what have you, the prices, went up. The collectors need money to fund this EIS to fund the potential for their future, so to speak. If you're a Hawaiian fish collector, you need the money to fund that study to try to get this back, right? When we talk about alternate locations for collection, we're too early into the discussion and too early into just the timeline of it in general to say, these fish are going to be able to be sourced out of X, Y, and Z. We know there's a couple that we've seen smatterings of yellow tangs come through even when Hawaii was open, and we have a rough understanding of what the pricing looked like then. But those are small scale and few and far between. So as suppliers, as supply lines do more exploration and where can we get to the yellow tangs, and perhaps more importantly, how can we handle the logistics of not only collecting the yellow tang, but getting the yellow tangs into the new countries. That's always been one of the biggest challenges, why Hawaii was so great. They've got the airport right there. You can get it right into the U.S., to Asia, to Europe, wherever. So those are the challenges that are being faced. How will the pricing play out? I think it's going to be fun to watch. Again, it would take a crystal ball to know at this point, but that one will be interesting to see. But there's a lot of pieces that have to fall together before we'll really be able to paint that story.
Yeah, I think when the yellow tangs were first bred, I think Matt wrote an article on them and got a quote from Dr. Callan where he was suggesting that roughly 300,000 to 400,000 yellow tangs in particular get imported to the U.S. every year. That's a crazy number, to be completely honest. That's a lot of fish that are now no longer being imported in the U.S. from Hawaii, or imported into domestic U.S. from Hawaii. So the demand is definitely there. Our aquaculture team is doing their best to try to, we were aquaculturing a good number. That number now needs to be great and kind of astronomical. But we are doing as much as we can to increase our employees out there, increase our sizing, increase our harems that we have spawning to kind of meet that demand. When the news broke, the interesting thing was to watch those prices fluctuate on like the retail and wholesale level from other distributors. We didn't change our pricing at all, and we saw things go up significantly everywhere. And we even asked some stores to kind of hold off on it. We asked some stores to wait to see what would happen. And it was definitely interesting to kind of see where the prices are sitting at even today.
Yeah, I want to kick this one over to Matt too, because Matt, I know you've covered this topic extensively as it's developed over the last several years up to the closure. What are your thoughts on all this?
Well, so an interesting thing while Alan was talking, and we were talking about the pricing and the crystal ball of the future, we've seen this happen a lot with other species in the past. And Alan, you might be in a position to speak about Hypancistris zebra. Yeah, it's just an example. We saw it happen with, the Banggai cardinal, and how that pricing ebbed and flowed from a $300 fish down to a fish that was, $5 or even $2 at some points. And then, the aquacultured fish was a $15 wholesale fish and, $50 retail. And then it was $5. And it just, so much of this jumps up and down and goes all around. But Hypancistris zebra has kind of found its new price point, no longer coming from the wild and being a several $100 fish. I'm going to put all my emotions about what I think has been done here to the side and simply say that it's gonna free up someone like Jake to pursue something that otherwise maybe wasn't financially viable, and that pursuit of any new aquaculture venture is going to give rise to other things. I can only presume that, you know, we look at aquacultured yellow tangs and now aquacultured purple tangs, and when will the aquaculture gem tang happen, or the scopus tang, or sail fins? It's all going to be driven by what's available and the pricing of that versus the pricing that it takes to produce this fish in captivity. But I don't think we can act like we don't have an idea what's going to happen. If wild caught yellow tangs come back, you know, as Alan was alluding to, I have to say, I don't think we're going to go have another source for yellow tangs like we had in Hawaii. So the only way that comes back is if Hawaii comes back. Basically, I think the problem I always had with this was that as much as I understand the value of sustainable fisheries and the value of having access to things, a lot of these animals, and just looking at the trajectory of the freshwater trade, it's almost more of, it's not an if, it's just a matter of when we're going to have to make these transitions. And you know, I've written once or twice that I'm all for sustainable harvest, but sometimes that sustainable harvest number is zero. You know, sometimes there is no sustainable level you can take of something. We could see that happen in our lifetime for any number of things. So it's best that the hobby and the industry are prepared to do responsible fish sourcing on both sides. I think Rhett Talbot is the person who really hit it home to me that when we argue about the fisheries and what happens, once that fish is off the reef, it doesn't matter what happens to it. It's a fish off the reef. And so, you know, whether we eat it or put it in a tank shouldn't matter. But it does matter because this wasn't really about the fishery. This was about aquarium hobby and looking for a scapegoat.
Right before we wrap up this future trends section, I just want to remind our audience one more time to submit any questions that you have to our panelists. Go to macna.org/questions, and we'll get on after the panel and answer those questions for you. So with that said, I'll put out the future directions question to the group and see where it goes.
I think, you know, when we look at future trends, and you know, aquaculture is definitely going to be a leader in that. But I think as a hobby, if we take, you know, we'll call it a 50,000 foot view, the hobby needs to, and the trade more importantly here, aquaculture is a great supply lane. It's got, you know, it's almost like exploring space. There's so much that we're going to learn, and so much we've learned, I feel like, just in the past year, you know, so, but it's going to be critical for the trade as a whole to act as one voice, to act as one trade. Different supply lines, aquaculture, mariculture, sustainable collection, can all complement each other and can all, you know, drive trends in this trade, and more importantly, in having the variety of supply lines and having that ability, you play off each other. You know, whether it's getting the fish for aquaculture, or whether it's aquaculture teaching sustainable collection how to transport, or mariculture, corals. I mean, they've great advancements through that, and implications for coral restoration in the wild. You know, the list goes on and on. But when you look at trends, you know, what's a big point of trends is to drive interest in the hobby, to drive people into the hobby, to grow the hobby. And for us to be able to grow the hobby, for us to have sustainable growth, we need to focus on being that one hobby where we can celebrate aquaculture right next to sustainable collection, right next to mariculture, as what can we get, how can we get the best out of every supply lane possible within this trade. And that's really, you know, from our perspective, from my perspective, when we talk about what's going to be the future of the industry, I think that's really the driving force behind it.
Yeah, to kind of bounce off what he's saying is we need to kind of mix the aquaculture with the sustainable collection to actually have a full supply line to get you your fish. Like, as I mentioned before, Chad said 300,000 to 400,000 yellow tang were coming to the US. Like, as much as I'd love to say we're breeding that many, we're not breeding that many overnight. So I think sustainable collection with a lot of these species mixed with aquaculture, just to have ideas of, like he said, easier ways to ship these fish to make sure that they're successfully actually brought into the US and make that trip safely. He's using our data and we're using our data to have those fish to successfully be in a hobbyist tank.
One thing I wanted to see in an evolving market is kind of some sort of responsibility by people who are attempting to set trends. You know, understand, you know, what you're about to do, in that, you know, is the market, is the fisheries that you're about to promote a sustainable one? Just because it does look cool, think about what you're about to do potentially to the entire supply chain and having to ramp it up, and then all of the lives and all of the people and all of the animals involved in that. And we need to start taking more kind of ethical concerns as to the fish, the transportation, the people, the entire thing. And so, if you do have the power to potentially start a trend, be mindful of the entire the entire supply chain.
Yeah, I agree with what Kevin just said, and just to add my 2 cents on top of it, I know the name game is a controversial thing. Some people love it, some people hate it, like we've said earlier towards the beginning of this panel discussion. But the name game really, it's almost at the point to where it's usable for science and conservation and sustainable management of fisheries, especially with regard to coral. So we see names coming out, like the retailer who names the specific morph, but we don't see other useful bits of information like collection localities or actual scientific names. A lot of times people are trading Teneus and some of these other Acropora, and they don't even know what species it is. They just know it by its morph name. And I think that if we do embrace the name game as a hobby, we should be very cognizant of what information we're trying to include and how that information affects the lineage of the coral, and what kind of information you can glean from playing the name game. So that's my 2 cents on coral. I just want to wrap up this panel discussion by asking each of you, what's the next big thing? What's it going to be? I've seen some crazy Ghanies and some crazy Blastos lately. We know that wrasses and tangs are pretty high up there on the aquaculture horizon as far as fish are concerned. What do you all think is going to pop up as the next trend, and how crazy do you think the prices are going to get?
I think it's twofold. There's two big trends that I think we're going to see. The first is going to be the continued push to find the odd, the unusual, the never seens, we didn't think we could ever keep that in aquariums before. I think we've seen a lot of that, especially with fish in the past few years. Think about where the fish market was and what you always saw, and then think about where it is pre-pandemic for the most part, but the diversity is greatly expanded. So that, and then I think, again, more conceptually, kind of what Matt was talking about, and I think Hunter touched on it earlier about asking questions, the ability to have better insight into supply lines, the ability to better understand what makes a sustainable supply line. I think that's going to be huge, as there's social media helps that, but the environmentalist push from a lot of different angles that has absolutely nothing to do with the aquarium trade. But as that becomes a bigger thing societally, the ability to define sustainability within this trade down to the supply chain level is going to be big. It's happening now. I think it's going to get to the point where it's industry-wide.
There's two thoughts that come to mind here for me. One is to kind of expand off what Matt said a bit ago. I would not only and Tim, you touched on it too, but not only to see some information as to where is this particular coral coming from in the wild, but I'd also like to see a shift back to people trying to actually do a scientific ID. I mean, Veyron has those volumes out there, right, that are super, super useful if you've just got a little bit of know-how on how to try to navigate through and figure out what is this, fancy name coral I just bought. And that's something I've done myself even with acros over the years, to try to figure out, what exactly is this, and where is it actually found on a wild reef, because that gives you so much information as to how to do best with it in your own tank. And then as far as, what's going to be the new trend, who knows, right? I mean, we could all pick something, but the one thing I think is worth noting is we're yet to see the same thing come up again, right? It's always something new. So I wouldn't look to anything we've already seen, which eliminates maybe a third of what's available in the trade. So, pick something that hasn't been a trend, and it's more likely to be the next big thing.
Kind of from my point of view, I pivot a lot on what you're thinking there, Hunter, is that we will start specializing. Actually, I think we're going to start specializing in things more, right? As we learn more about where our animals are coming from, right? We know where they're coming from, and we know we can start keeping biotypes, and that type of education and interest with social media and the internet and all these things we can learn as hobbyists, we can really start to dive in and just be like a super nerdy expert in one thing. And especially with tank sizes, honestly, I think tank sizes are going down, right? And with smaller tank sizes, biotypes make a lot more sense as well. And then a little bit on that point, with a smaller tank size, you can spend a lot more on one thing because you're not buying as many things to fill your tank. So pricing doesn't matter. Like, if you want it, you'll pay for it. And there are so many people out there that have so much money. It's just stupid. And they'll do it. They'll pay for it if they want it. There's a reason why football players have fish tanks.
There's one thing I'm not gonna say what I think it is, because I'm gonna put it in a magazine. So I'm not gonna talk about it right now. Kevin knows, because Kevin and I have talked about it very briefly. But it kind of dovetails on, you can look, I feel like playing in both the freshwater and the saltwater world, I could see a lot of what happens in the saltwater world has happened in the freshwater world. So I think if we want to see the way a hobby can ebb and flow and grow and change, you have to look to what's happened there and what's continuing to happen there. And you'll have a different level of insight. But I have no idea. I just know what I think is cool, which is the doing of things that haven't been done before. That is what being a marine aquarist is to me. It's
by what Matt said, I can't say mine now, because I know what that's going to be, and I was going to say that up until Matt mentioned that. But as we've seen here in Mini MACNA, with Jamie's research in the UK, and now researchers picking up sexual propagation of corals now around the world, we're going to start seeing a lot of new coral and sexual reproduction of coral, not only in wholesale facilities, but also potentially at the LFS level and at the hobbyist level. And so now we're going to be able to basically from our phones, we're going to be able to pick up our phone and have like a breed mode potentially. And it's going to be, like all the hardware is in place, all the water quality is in place. And then potentially, let's say in 6 to 8 lunar cycles, so about 6 to 8 months, we could start seeing gametes in our marine aquarium tanks and coral reproduction. Getting those to settle and grow those out, that's going to be potentially the next thing for the MBI. The MBI is just the Marine Breeding Initiative. It's been almost purely fish until recently. So potentially we need to investigate a whole new area of marine breeding. And so that's where I think we're going to be going here in the near future.
All right, everybody. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time for this Mini MACNA. Thank you so much to all of you, Alan, Hunter, Jake, Joanne, and Matt, for joining us. Your insight has been just super cool, and it was great to pick your brains for 45 minutes. We're really excited to see what the trends actually look like and what they turn into. Really excited to see what Biota comes out with. Excited to see what Seagrass continues to provide our hobby with, and we're excited to see what hobbyists demand of the market in the next few years. So with that said, thank you guys very much. To our audience, again, if you have any questions for our panelists, please go to macna.org/questions, and we will get those answered after the panel discussion. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.